The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us on our new session with the GUESS webinar series. For our first attendees, the GUESS webinar series serves as a platform for the GUESS network members to share experience and expertise in evidence synthesis and to learn about potential collaborations. As you realize, we are all muted as soon as the webinar session starts, but if you have any question, please feel free to send it using the toolbar on your right, labeled questions. You can also use the raise your hand button so that we can unmute you whenever we give time for discussion. Today's session is on nutritional epidemiology, better research and for the right reasons. Our presenters are Professor Carl Leshaw, Professor Dr. Wim Pinkston, and Ms. Dana Hawash. Dr. Carl Leshaw is a professor of nutrition epidemiology. His research is focused on strategies to enhance the quality of nutrition epidemiology and dietary assessment, i.e. through better reporting of research findings, equitable research partnerships, effective reuse of nutrition data for research and decisions, and effective use and interpretation of evidence for decision-making. Nutrition-sensitive agriculture, such as improvement of micronutrient status of vulnerable populations through better soil, nutrition, and health. Sustainable diets, such as contribution of local biodiversity for better health and nutrition in women and children. Carl is the deputy editor of Public Health Nutrition Journal, a member of Working Group on Food Classifications of Global Open Data in Agriculture and Nutrition, and the Working Group on Dietary Assessment and Risk of Global Burden of Disease Study. Professor Dr. Wim Pinkston is Associate Professor at Hasselt University in Belgium and previously worked as a researcher in medical ethics and health law at the Erasmus MC Rotterdam, the Netherlands, Louvain University, and the International Forum for Biophilosophy in Belgium. As a researcher in medical ethics and health law, he has been involved in research projects on the triage of elderly at intensive care units, the ethical and legal aspects of pediatric clinical trials, and the ethical aspects of anti-aging. He is currently project leader of several research projects on the motivations of minors to participate in clinical research, ethical issues and incidental findings through imaging and population-based research, ethical issues in preconception care, evaluation of competency-based learning in medical education, and research integrity. He lectures medical ethics for medical students. Wim is a member of the Research Ethics Committee of Hasselt University, of the Institutional Review Board of the Institute of Tropical Medicine, and of the Belgium Advisory Committee on Bioethics. He also serves as a project advisor for several international research projects. And Ms. Dana Hawash. Dana has started her PhD at Ghent University in Ethics in Nutrition, Epidemiology Research in 2015. Her PhD uses interdisciplinary approach to improve the quality of nutritional epidemiology research. For this purpose, she has been developing tools and guidelines at different stages of the research cycle. Reporting guidelines at the publication stage, STROBE-nut, and value-oriented framework for priority settings at the initiation phase. Dana is currently leading 2 studies to understand the applicability of STROBE-nut. Dana has also obtained her Master's in Science in Applied Human Nutrition and Rural Development at Ghent University. She did 6 months of internship at the UN Standing Committee on Nutrition in Geneva and obtained her BSc Bachelor of Science in Nutrition and Dietetics from Birzeit University, Palestine. Besides her studies, she is passionate about mindfulness practices, including meditation and yoga. She offers weekly yoga classes at the faculty for PhD students and faculty members. Thank you all for being with us today. So Dana and Carl, I will give you the mic and the screen. Just don't forget to unmute.
Okay. Are we coming through fine?
Perfect.
Yeah? Okay. Hello, everybody. We say hi from Belgium. Today's presentation will be a shared presentation by myself and Dana, who are in Ghent. And then for the last part, we will hand over to Wim Pinkston, who is based in Hasselt and who will speak from that location. What we will try to do today is we will give you an introduction to some work in nutritional epidemiology within the context of better research for the right reasons. I think we should be around 45 minutes, and we'll try to monitor the time closely so we have time for questions if any. Okay, maybe I'll remove this one. Okay, we will first deal with a short introduction on research waste and some of the concerns we have in nutrition epidemiology. I'll be briefly discussing some of the work we've been doing on the reporting guidelines and how reporting guidelines are a potential useful way to reduce research waste. Dana will then take over and discuss how to set better priorities or how to consider some values when setting priorities in nutrition research. And we will finalize with ethical reflections. What is important is that we also see this this webinar as a way to network, because we would really welcome people that are willing to comment on the work that we've been doing, apply it, modify it, challenge it, and take it forward. So if you have any interest or desire to collaborate with us on these aspects, please feel free to contact us during the webinar or also afterwards. We started working on this essentially after the launch of the Lancet series on research waste, which is a collection of papers published in 2014. If you haven't read that series, but I assume that most of you are aware of that, that piece of work, then it's really worth having a look, because I think it presents some important aspects into the area of biomedical research and some of the problems that we face in that area. I'm just taking out one observation of that series that are listed there as bullets. And for instance, of more than 20,000 reports published in 6 leading journals, only one of them, and you see the cascade there, led to development of an intervention. So there's really room for better value and added value in research in general. And the problems are multiple, and they are occurring through the different stages of the research cycle. We've summarized here the main steps of a research cycle, inspired by the categories that were presented in the Lancet series. And essentially that series lists some of the actions that could be undertaken at different settings. For instance, better setting of priorities, better consideration of existing knowledge, using, for instance, systematic reviews, better research design, definitions of outcomes, but also management and data analysis. And then lastly, better research reporting and publishing, which would then hopefully lead to a better understanding of what is not known and what is already known that drives research agendas. Today, first, I will discuss the aspects on research reporting and publishing. I think it's a new area that has been underserved in nutrition science, for that matter. There is lots of textbooks on how to design nutrition programs, on nutritional epidemiology research, how to manage your data and analyze your data, but there's much less work on how to make sure research findings are complete and usable for readers. So I'll be first dealing with this, and then Dana on the priority setting aspects will take over on the other aspect of the research cycle, which is essentially the start in defining good research questions. Also taken from the Lancet series is an overview of why reporting matters. And what you see here, that if you do a systematic review, and I assume most of you are engaged in that process, you notice that many research reports are unusable because maybe you don't find the right information, or maybe the information that you would like to use is not well described that allow you to assess its quality. So this leads to obviously a poor and perhaps also a flawed conclusion arising from those systematic efforts, and obviously a loss of financial resources, time, and money from the people that were associated. Obviously, it can also lead to a biased set of research and incorrect interpretation of findings. Now, with nutrition epidemiology, we try to assess the relationship between diets or nutritional nutrition as an exposure and health in humans. It's a relatively younger discipline within epidemiology, and it's only, I think, about 100 years ago that we started working on understanding how diets and nutrition affect health. So the epidemiological aspects have started even much later, and we're still struggling, as I will try to introduce that later. And there are also indications that reporting is problematic. What I have taken out there is a summary of the reviews done by the Nordic Nutrition Recommendation. So they want to devise food-based dietary guidelines for the Nordic countries, and they obviously went through a number of reviews of literature. And a large majority of that literature was not useful because some of the details that were considered essential were missing. So in this context, we started working with a group to try and resolve that. What I also have to say is that what makes it also a little bit special in nutrition is that we have particular methodological challenges. It's still very difficult to assess dietary intake. We rely on imperfect measures to assess what people have consumed. They are very subjective. We know there are many errors associated with it, and hence diet as an exposure remains difficult to interpret. There are some advances in the sense that there are some biomarkers and maybe some automated tools, but they are still quite young and still will not address the bias that we observe. Secondly, another challenge that we see in nutrition, that we have lots of intercorrelations between our exposures. We don't know how different nutrients act together in the body. We don't know how they work synergistically or antagonistically, and hence that makes it very difficult to interpret a collection of nutrients as an exposure, such as a diet. So there are many good comments, and I think they were a wake-up call for people working in nutrition epidemiology, where some of the headings you see there below are illustrating. Is everything what we eat associated with cancer? Probably, if you find studies and if you look long enough, every nutritional or every ingredient that you may find in the cookbook has been shown to be associated with cancer somewhere. So there is definitely concern and scope for improvement. What we have done is we have tried to come up with a reporting guideline for our type of research. And I am pretty confident that you know the STROBE statement, but for those of you that are unfamiliar with it, it's a reporting guideline for observational studies. So it is a set of recommendations containing 22 items for cohort study, case controls, and cross-sectional studies. And what is maybe particular in the STROBE statement is that there were extensions for specific technical areas. For instance, molecular epidemiology or infectious disease. And with the group working on the Nordic nutrition diets, we thought it would be appropriate to also present our work for nutrition as an extension of the STROBE statement. Although ultimately we would hope that people that work on trials and assess diets are also benefiting from those recommendations. So in a nutshell, we went through an extensive consultation process with a large group of people. We used the Delphi round to come up with 24 recommendations for better reporting of nutritional epidemiology and dietary assessment. It's called STROBE-nut, so it's an extension for nutrition epidemiology of the STROBE statement. And the idea is that we provide a checklist that can be filled or used by authors when writing at manuscripts, together with the STROBE-nut explanation and elaboration document that explains why these certain items are there and gives examples on what maybe is a good way of reporting. And other STROBE extensions are obviously complementing what we've done. So, for instance, the STROBE extension on molecular epidemiology would be a useful checklist to have in combination with this. So I will maybe spend less time here. This is the procedure we followed. We did an international consultation round with experts to build consensus on the items. And in the end, we ended up with, for instance, the checklist table that you see here that has, as a classical extension of the STROBE statement, specific items listed next to the STROBE items. So the idea is that the nutritional specifications are used in combination with the STROBE statement. So it builds and it adds on the STROBE statement, and it should not be used in isolation from it. This is published a while ago, and it's been used regularly, maybe less than I would have hoped, but some journals are adopting it and it's becoming widespread. So we hope also that people apply it more and more and also come back to us with comments. What we are still facing now with regard to our extension and the reporting guideline is we would like to get people's view on how they understand our recommendations or the text, how they should apply it and how they really apply it in practice. Is everything that important? Are there aspects that are more important than others? Is there a way of rationalizing? Because I think 24 items in a reporting guideline is a lot asked from reviewers. So within a few years, we will probably look at it again and then see how we can make it better. And any comments that we have received from users are useful to guide us in that process. And next thing that we currently discuss extensively is how we can use such recommendations for publishing as a way to do better research. Can we not involve those reporting guidelines earlier during the start of writing, because we assume that most of the researchers essentially use it in the end because essentially they want to comply with journal requirements. So we want to try and see how people can integrate that into their work stream earlier, and we're trying to build some specific tools on that. If you want to pilot a few things or try a few things out, or maybe you're just curious on how that could be done, please reach out. So in the end, I want to finish by saying STROBE-nut is a continuous and interactive process. And please, we welcome all feedback, comments, and new evidence on strobenut.org. I think there's still a lot of work to be done, and any person or partner that is willing to give us a hand is welcomed. I will hand over to Dana, who will take up the next part.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'll be talking about the next tool we've developed for nutrition epidemiology. It's called Consideration of Values when Setting Priorities in Nutrition Research, Guidance for Transparency. And today this paper got accepted, so in a few weeks you could enjoy reading the paper. So in fact, Carl at the beginning explained about the waste in the research cycle. He explained that we started working on research, reporting and publishing, and at one stage you were like thinking we might be intervening at way too late in the cycle. And we were together thinking, how can we also develop tools at an earlier stage, not only during the writing process, but even earlier when research questions are being set. So we decided to target priority setting and question selections. So what are really research priority setting exercises? They're in fact a formal procedure to reach consensus on a set of questions that can lead research. And in fact, they're important because it's been said that development is blind without prioritization. And it's also because there's not enough resources to research every question we have. So in fact, with the limited resources and with the idea of wanting to focus and wanting to develop and wanting to find intervention that help humans, priority setting exercises are quite important. So there is a problem in priority setting because we wanted to check first what is the problem and how we can intervene. But before we can look at the problem, we look at the priority setting cycle. The cycle is really well explained in the priority setting for research, for health and management process for countries. I kept you the link so that you can take a look at it. So priority setting normally start by assessing the situation, setting the scene, and then choosing the best method to do the priority setting exercise. Then planning priority settings, setting the priorities, and making them work. So in fact, it's quite an exhaustive cycle, and it needs a lot of stakeholders to be involved, and it needs a lot of preparation and a lot of expertise. In this slide, it explains exactly what needs to be done in each stage. And in priority setting, it's basically a group of stakeholders coming together. So it's a lot of interaction, a lot of communication, and a lot of discussions going on to set the most important research questions. So I will not go a lot on this slide, but you can always refer to it back. So the idea of a good priority setting exercise is being built on systematic reviews, having a really good assessment of the situation, and while setting the scene, having a clear focus on what you're doing the priority setting exercise, having ethical standards, and engaging the right partners. Then there's this, you have to choose a method for priority setting exercise, and in fact there are a lot of methods for priority settings, including workshops, including child and health for nutrition tool and Delphi method. There are also other that combine mixture of tools to set the priority setting. So in fact, it depends on making a set of questions and ranking the priorities and having discussions until the set is there. So there is the priority setting, and then there is making the priority setting work as well by having actions after priority setting, monitoring and evaluation, and setting date for the questions to already be researched. So what is lacking and what needs to be done? In fact, as I said before, priority setting is an activity where there's a lot of discussion of different stakeholders. So when stakeholders are involved in the process, they come in with their own values and interests. And values are rarely made explicit, and the systematic way of defining and considering values is generally lacking. So the consideration of values in priority setting is not automatic, and we thought that this is lacking, and it's important to understand how values are being considered in priority setting. There's already some ethical frameworks for priority setting, including accountability for reasonableness by Norman Daniels. Yet, in fact, they're predefined values, and they're not quite explained how to use them in practical implementation. So we aim at making a tool where values are being considered not only when you use your method, yet in fact at every stage of the priority setting cycle. The methodology we used to make the tool, to create the tool, was based on three-step approach. First, we made a mapping review of the nutrition research priority setting exercises. Then we used qualitative analysis approach to identify values reported in the papers of the mapping reviews, and organize these values in a tool. After we made the tool, we send it for consultation down with the authors of priority setting exercises to give their opinion on the tool. For the first step, for the mapping review, in fact, we made a protocol. I also keep the reference in the slide. We developed a searching syntax using PICO, we searched 5 online databases, including Medline, Web of Science, Cochrane, TRIP, and Embase. We also searched Gray literature documents using Gray literature report database and targeted websites. We also stretched the search for external experts that we consulted for priority settings. This is the graph of how we did the systematic review, and I will just focus on the last bit of it, where we ended up having 27 papers, 22 peer-reviewed papers, and 5 from the Gray literature. So from the mapping review, we did 2 things. First, we made a table with the characteristics of the papers found, the 27 papers, and at the same time, we used these papers as the starting point for the qualitative analysis. So in this slide, I will just explain what the general characteristics of these priority settings in nutrition research. We found that 40% of the papers used more than one method to set priorities. So they used maybe workshop with a Delphi or a workshop with a Chenry method. So it was more than one method being used to set priorities. Almost 60% of the papers described the represented stakeholders. There were like 40% where we don't know exactly the stakeholders that were engaged in setting the priorities. More than half of the papers did not report on the follow-up activities, in a sense where priority setting exercises has had a set of questions as a result, yet nothing is being explained on what will be done with this set of questions. And lastly, all priority setting exercises were led by research groups based in high-income countries. For the next step, we decided to take these 27 papers and do a qualitative analysis to extract values. Yet, to extract values, we had to develop our own strategy with the support of Professor Wim Pinkston. To define values, we had 2 criteria. First, the values are general descriptions of what matters, for instance, like honesty. Yet, it's not measurable in a way that we're not saying don't lie is how we define honesty. Another example could be transparency as value. It's not that we want that it is reported. It is reported is the norm, is how we want to see transparency. So in fact, it's general description of what matters, like honesty, transparency. The second criteria is a value is seen as an action focused on achieving a solved purpose and not an action carried out to achieve something further. For instance, education in itself is value, yet we value education because it improves the quality of living. So in that sense, in our analysis, quality of living as a value was considered because it is focused on an end, quality of living, that's the value. And education was considered as means to an end. It's a means to having better quality of life. So in that sense, and through iterative qualitative content analysis, 2 researchers coded all the papers independently and then discussed differences in coding until agreement was reached. At the beginning, with the coding and the notes, we had 8 big clusters of values, including understanding, impact, feasibility, efficacy, equity, soundness, sustainability, and nobility. And from that stage, we had a lot of ongoing meetings between the core group of this paper to simplify these clusters and to make a tool that is easy to be used by researchers and it's applicable. So the end result of these meetings was a table, a tool with 3 values, including feasibility, impact, and accountability. After we had the tool, we sent it for consultation round with the authors of the priorities setting papers that were found in the systematic review. We choose the first and the last author of all retrieved papers in step 1, and we contacted them for feedback on the tool and if they have comments on the wordings, on the use, we asked them to send it in. From the 17 authors who replied to participate in the consultation round, several authors provided feedback. Authors included experts from the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, GAIN, and from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and from the Council on Health Research and Development cohort. In response to the feedback, the layout of the tool was simplified. The comments, we had received comments regarding rewording and the logic of ordering, of which we all considered. In this slide, I'll explain the tool. So this is the end result of the tool. It has a column for values, a column explaining what values are, the relevance, and decision points to be considered. So in fact, this table is more of a discussion tool. It's not obliged to go through it one by one. So you look at it as a whole. And in fact, it's also kept very flexible and easy to be used. So there is TBD, which means to be determined. For each value, feasibility, impact, and accountability, stakeholders engaged in the process can add other sub-values that are important for their for their exercise, for their needs. Also, they can add more values, including, so if feasibility, impact, and accountability are not enough, then they can add a new value at the end of the table. Also, it is more of a discussion tool in a sense where consensus and agreement, total agreement, is not really what we're seeking. It's more of transparency on what stakeholders agreed on and disagreed on, and what kind of values were the determining values that were used during the priority setting as a whole. And in that sense, stakeholders can go into these values at the beginning, at the end, and in the middle. They can keep checking to make sure that values were considered and there was transparency. So in that sense, we can have more openness on what values driven the priority setting exercises. So for an example, for feasibility, we have underneath it answerable and realistic, and we have an explanation for each of these sub-values, and also these explanations can also be broadened by the stakeholders involved. And it's important to say that this value-oriented tool, it's more to be used on the exercise as a whole and not on each question that will be proposed. It is on, before starting, it's interesting to understand that there are common values between all stakeholders. So why do we think this tool is important? Because the tool first is built on inclusive, it's inclusive and builds on what is currently reported in the literature. And although it is developed using nutrition research, we consider it equally useful to other types of research that rely on a broad stakeholder involvement. It also provides a set of values that can be systematically discussed in the process of priority setting exercises. It can serve as reporting instrument to increase transparency on how values were considered. It improves rational use of limited resource for research, and it aims to draw attention on the accountability and ensures attention regarding values during the process. And in this webinar, we really are calling for action. So the proposed tool requires testing and evaluation by various stakeholder groups to ensure its correct understanding and application. So we seek and encourage contribution from groups who work on research prioritization and are willing to apply the tool in their process to contact us. And also to make it easier to be used, we developed a manual of use to assess the testing of the tool, and I include also a reference for the manual of use that explains what is the tool, the purpose, how to use it, when to use it, and how to use it as a reporting tool when needed. And from here, I will hand it over to Wim. He will explain the ethical approach behind it.
Okay, good afternoon. I'd like to start with saying I'm very happy with the collaboration we had in this work with Carl, Dana, and myself because of the interdisciplinary nature of work. It was really a way of engaging ethics with nutritional sciences and the other way around. And I think that's the way we should move forward in having ethical approaches. And I'll first tell a bit about my discipline to show how ethics plays a role here, what exactly we did, and what's the relevance of it. Maybe we can go to the next slide. Dana, you'll have to move my slide. So if you ask what ethics is about, I often use this book cover because it says on what matters, and that's exactly what ethics does. Ethics engages with what matters, and in fact, some things matters to all people. It need not to be the same things, but all people value things. It's a human characteristic that we attribute value to things we like or endeavor. So it's quite a good definition of what ethics is about, and we can say that values is a central concept for discussing ethics, and that's exactly what Dana did in the framework. We started from values, and defining values is not so easy because not everybody shares the same language. As has been noted, often values are confused with means to an end, with norms. And in addition, there's a large variety of values. Not all people value the same. It changes throughout location, persons, time, and so on. So we need to account for that, and we will find a large heterogeneity of values if we take different sources. That doesn't need to be a problem, because instead of being all impartial, ethics tends to be all partial. We can take all values into account, whether we agree with them or not. Doesn't even matter. It's just a matter whether they can be considered. And that's what the framework also does. It lists a whole bunch of values, but people are free to choose which to consider. And in fact, we consider all, but which to agree with and which to not prioritize. So it's open for use. Maybe we can go to the next slide. So if we go for values, we will see things that matter to us, that we find important. And if we do that, we will also find dilemmas. Why? Because values will compromise each other. We can find different things important, like services having a car repaired, for example, being fast, cheap, and great. It's all good, 3 things that we find valuable, but most often you won't be capable of having everything at the same time. So you will get compromises by nature. If you want to have your car repaired, you can choose 2 out of the 3 values. If you want it cheap and great, it won't be fast. If you want it fast and cheap, it won't be great, and so on. So values can compromise each other, and that happens all the time in real life. So we have to deal with these ethical dilemmas. If we have values conflicting with each other, which one are we going to give priorities? Which arguments do we have for this? And this needs consideration, and that's not an automatic process. We need to gain insight in that, and that's exactly what ethics tries to do. Next slide, please. So ethics as a discipline had kind of a long history in which it changed a lot. If you go to traditional ethics, you often end up with the ancient Greeks. Then you had a long time of more or less stability, some changes. And then the real applied bioethics, as we know now, came up from the 1950s. So that's where the bioethics of today were born. And these bioethics have really been in search for an identity and a method. What kind of a discipline was it? It were philosophers who were not well acquainted often with medical practices or biomedical research. So we needed to search what is medical ethics about. The discipline mainly focused on applied ethics, which means we devise principles, we define principles, and we're going to apply them to practice. But we easily noticed as ethicists that this has a really limited problem-solving capacity. It's not so easy to just solve problems by applying principles, because these principles will internally conflict, we need interpretation, and so on. And so over the past decades, we had more and more of empirical ethics, where we have a clear underpinning in data of what's going on, what people think about what the attitudes are, the risks, the consequences, and also in the development of the framework here, we really started from what people considered as a value. We just didn't invent the values in previous priority setting exercises from the 27 papers in the review, and we tried to extract all the values that were already there, which was already a very nice collection. Next slide. Okay, so if we see the challenge, it is the main challenge is how to get the ethical reflection really into scientific and other practices. In policies, you can easily have a theoretical ethical reflection that doesn't really end up in the practice, and you can have practices trying to do ethics but not really embedding the reflection. So you need to reconcile both, and that's not always easy. So the problem is how to organize a more systematic approach. And then we need to emphasize, and that's really important, that ethical reflection is not an automatism. Values are taken for granted. They don't easily come to the surface. You really have to go looking for them, make them explicit, consider them. And if not done, these can really be easily ignored in practice. So it's something that needs to be fostered, and a tool such as a framework Dana developed can really help to do this. So in the approach, we can have a systematic consideration of values, in this case extracted from previous priority setting exercises and other sources, such as the expert feedback, Gray literature, and so on. And then we see that values that have been extracted offer a common language and interest to discuss values. And the nice thing with which I'm going to end is that this can really lead to an open-ended approach. So ethics is often defined as adhering to the highest standards of ethical behavior, but nobody knows what it is. Ethics is open for choice. It doesn't bring final answers. It's a matter of human choices at some point. And in this case, it's an explicit choice not to impose values and say this is what nutrition research should be about, but give a list of the values that are up for consideration. These are things that might be very relevant to prioritize certain aspects of research in nutrition, and it's better to consider them in any way than ignoring them. That doesn't automatically mean they should all get priority, and that's explicitly in the table. You can prioritize them, but it makes well-considered choices, and that's exactly what ethics aim for, to increase reflection rather to impose certain outcomes. So that's a bit where I wanted to end my small story on ethics, and leaves us some time for answering your questions.
Thank you, Donna, thank you, Carl, and thank you, Wim, for this great presentation. So we will start now with taking questions. So first we have Aaron, who would like to ask a question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for your nice presentations. All the time I was finding myself to these challenges that we are facing all the time regarding the standardized terminology or the standardized reporting methodology, or also the standardized ethical reflection upon different research, especially nutrition research. And I was thinking that this work is very important. However, I have like a personal, very from my experience, challenge huge, which I find in many countries, and countries that I know well, that maybe that I don't know if it is relevant. This is why I want to put this on your table. Is it relevant to accelerate and encourage the standardized reporting method by making, like, I don't know, a systematic review or a repository or something to put a spectrum with all the countries regarding the fundamental research requirements, like from the one end of the spectrum, let's say for nutrition research, basically. From the one end of the spectrum should be like, does the country have food composition tables, or has the country done ever any application or validation of any intake recording method? And from the other spectrum, let's say there will be like advanced research capacities like nutrigenomics or something different, more advanced, which is at the edge now of nutrition research, and to report like each country, what is the progress, and by this way, maybe I think that we can encourage priority set each country. For example, let's say country X has never done observational research regarding food intake, or this country has no food composition tables, and by this means the universities or the researchers in this country and policy making and decision making can see on the map where are the gaps to fill and to set the research priorities in the field of nutrition. And this is a great moment just to mention, because it's like a very interesting moment that the decade of action on nutrition of the United Nations is happening, and perhaps this can increase the visibility of such efforts for standardizing and unifying terminology, reporting, ethics in nutrition research. Thank you. I don't know if I make sense, but thank you.
Okay, Adams, maybe I'll take your question. Thank you. It's a relevant question, and it's a timely question. There are many initiatives to map activities in nutrition. You might be aware of the FAO, for instance, has a repository of food composition tables. There's also policy reviews. So what you are proposing has been done to some extent. Maybe not on all of the aspects. It's definitely an expensive exercise, an administrative challenging exercise, what you're proposing, listing all of the research, especially when you think about observational studies. One could think that maybe from existing repositories we can tease out information like who does trials where. I imagine that is registered somewhere and we can map that. Who has food composition tables, where are the policies, who does what. There are different initiatives such as the Nourishing Framework by the World Cancer Research Funds. There's the Informas project that maps. There's also the WHO has quite a large toolbox on what is going on where with the GINA platform. So I think there is already quite a bit of information available, but it is scattered. So you have to go there to FAO for food composition tables, you have to go to WHO for policies. But maybe bringing that together into a more comprehensive overview, that would be good. Maybe that could be a suggestion for the people who write the Global Nutrition Report, to prepare some sort of readiness map, if I could call that. I know there was a readiness or a landscape analysis on readiness for countries to accelerate action in nutrition, but that was just a few countries where they would scale up nutrition, and not all of the countries in the world. So I think a lot has been done already. The added value of putting them together, yes, maybe we can discuss about that. On what timely basis that should be done, I think this is maybe also a relevant question.
Great.
Thank you.
So do we have any other questions? So actually, Carl, Donna, and Wim, how much time did it take you overall for the whole process from the step one all the way till now? How much time has it been?
Well, it took us 1 year and a half, 2 years to have the tool ready, the value-oriented.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Maybe I can add to that. I think the reflections, and I think that's also interesting to realize, a couple of years ago, we were involved in a project from the EU to develop a nutrition research agenda for Africa, and it's called the Sunray Project. And so we were thinking on research questions and priorities for nutrition research with a whole collaboration, in fact. And then we happened, well, this is how it goes. There was a personal connection with Wim, and suddenly we started realizing that setting values or setting research priorities, the way we look at it, nutrition research is a very technocratic process. We think of, cost effectiveness and this type of things, but ultimately it's also what you want in terms of society and where to invest and where to give priority to. So this is where we are, where we were stuck and say, look, we can rank intervention based on cost effectiveness, but that still doesn't bring us very far into a discussion on what we value as important in this group. And secondly, it doesn't help us. It should also be helpful to make transparent accounts of how those values were set, who were in that process, and what did they think was important for them at that point. So to make that transparent process possible, we started working on this. So the reflections went back a longer time and were essentially driven by a need to develop such tools from our end.
Oh, this is very nice.
Maybe I can add, also ethically, it was kind of a big challenge because we have been looking for similar studies that have been done in the past or a methodology we could use, but it was really something we had to sort out. How can we do this? Which way would work? Because on the one hand, you don't want to make it a matter of luck or hazard whether values end up into the consideration of priority setters. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you don't want to impose any values to anyone and keep it open-ended and free. So the existing studies offered a good basis to look for that, but we had to look for specific methods, formulations, and it took us quite some effort to get to a system in which we could reliably, with several people independently from each other, come to the same conclusions in the analysis and really have robust results in the values that were already in the existing studies. But I think we can be very happy with the results. But it has been, there was no paved path to do this kind of research within ethics research as well. So it has been quite a challenge to develop this.
Nice. Okay, great. So Wim, I'm sure it hasn't been very easy for you, for adding ethics to tools that have already been used in the health research field, but also values specifically, and potentially other variables. I mean, even if it comes to feasibility, accessibility, values and preferences, so all the values that we use, all the factors, that we usually take into consideration when developing clinical guidelines, for example. So how do you see this, your intervention here as, the expert in ethics for values specifically? How do you see you can take that on the bigger level on all the factors that we would include in a clinical guideline?
Well, I think, in fact, in the ethics, you try to foster reflection into the practice itself. So it's, as an ethicist, you cannot take over the work that has to be done on the floor. And it's a matter of being well informed of what is already been done in a practice. So in this case, we didn't have to come up with any values because they were already there, and we could ask for further clarification among the authors and look in the grey literature and start from the papers that were already there. But I think it has become a major task for ethics to engage with practice and see what we can do to have more practical tools and theoretical considerations on what should be done in theory, but how we can approach things in practice. And I think this is a step forward in that direction.
Nice.
But I think Tamara, sorry to interrupt. I think your suggestion is really valuable there. But how to make this relevant, or how to consider this in the context of setting clinical guidelines, I think it's a really good question. But I think we would welcome a discussion on that with people who are really involved into these processes.
Yep.
Okay, great. So as it seems like we don't have any more questions. I have 2 points to make. For our attendees, please make sure to contact Carl, Dana, and Wim if you would like to try the tool out, if you would like to pilot it, and they are more than happy to receive feedback and also offer guidance. But also, Carl, Dana, and Wim, would you be, I've been asked about the slides. Are you okay with sharing the slides?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we'll add our email addresses as well, so that makes it easier to contact.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for joining us today and for this great presentation.
Thank you, Tamara, for hosting.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks for hosting and listening.
And thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Stay tuned for our upcoming webinar sessions. And the recording of this session would be available on our website starting a week from now. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.